My brother's wedding stopped feeling like a celebration the moment he pointed at the floor in front of his bride. "Kneel," Marcus said. "Apologize for being jealous of her, or get out." A few of his friends laughed. My mother whispered that I should just do it and deal with the rest tomorrow. I went down on my knees because, for one humiliating second, 8 years of keeping the peace felt stronger than my pride. Then I stood. I looked at Camille and said, "Before you marry him, ask what he once begged me to keep secret." Her smile disappeared. Marcus went white. "Stay with me, because what happened after I stood up changed far more than a wedding. And if you enjoy stories about family, betrayal, and hard-earned truth, please subscribe and keep listening." 37 minutes earlier, the room had still looked beautiful enough to fool me. The old riverfront warehouse had been stripped down to brick walls, tall windows, polished concrete, and warm hanging lights that softened everything they touched. September sunlight came through the glass in long, pale rectangles. Beyond the windows, the Mississippi looked almost silver. About 90 people moved between the welcome tables and the open cocktail area, while the coordinator quietly reminded everyone that the formal vows would begin at 4:30. Marcus and Camille had chosen to greet everyone together beforehand, instead of disappearing until the ceremony. It suited my brother. Marcus had always been at his best in rooms where people were arriving. He remembered names, touched elbows, made introductions, found the exact joke that made a nervous stranger feel included. Watching him work a crowd had once made me proud. By then, it mostly made me tired. I had almost declined the invitation. Marcus and I had spent years perfecting a kind of distance that looked respectable from the outside. We attended the necessary birthdays. We answered family messages. We could stand beside each other for photographs without anyone seeing what had gone missing. I came because Mom wanted both of her children in the same room, and because Camille had never treated me badly. She had always been careful around me, perhaps a little too careful, but never cruel. What unsettled me first was not Marcus. It was his friends. 3 men from the group clustered near the bar looked at me, then at one another, with the faint, knowing amusement of people who had been told some kind of family moment was coming. One gave me a small grin when our eyes met. I checked my dress, wondered whether something was wrong with it, then dismissed the feeling as nerves. I had spent too many years expecting embarrassment whenever Marcus and I shared a room. I was not going to manufacture one before anything had happened. At a few minutes after 4, the coordinator lowered the music. Guests were not seated yet. People simply turned toward Marcus and Camille near the front of the hall, while Marcus thanked everyone for coming early. Camille stood beside him in a simple ivory dress, one hand resting lightly against his arm. She looked happy in the quiet, concentrated way people do when they have been planning a day for months and finally realize it has arrived. Then Marcus said my name. The sound traveled through the room before I understood why. He smiled toward me and began talking about family, old wounds, and the importance of entering marriage without unfinished business. He referred to the tension between us as though it were a charming family flaw everyone already understood. Then he used the word that had followed me for 8 years: jealousy. Several faces turned in my direction. Marcus said we had carried it long enough and that there was no better time to put it behind us than before he began his married life. My stomach tightened. Camille glanced at me. She did not look shocked that Marcus had planned some kind of reconciliation. What changed her expression was my face. I stayed where I was. Marcus kept smiling. He spoke over the silence, as if I were simply nervous, then motioned for me to come forward. That was when I understood the looks from his friends. They had been expecting me to be part of whatever family closure Marcus had promised would happen. I walked, because remaining frozen at the edge of the room somehow felt worse. Every step across that polished floor made the surrounding voices disappear until I could hear only the faint scrape of shoes and the blood beating behind my ears. Marcus stood with the relaxed posture of a man certain the next 30 seconds belonged to him. When I reached him, I kept my voice low enough that only the people closest to us could hear. I told him I had never agreed to apologize. His smile did not disappear. It hardened. There was a difference. For a moment, the brother I knew existed underneath the groom everyone else was watching. His jaw shifted. His fingers tightened around the microphone. Then he turned my refusal into another part of the performance, making some light remark about how stubbornness had always been my favorite defense. A few people laughed. I looked at Camille. Her hand had dropped away from Marcus's arm. I should have left then. Instead, I hesitated, and Marcus saw it. He pointed toward the floor in front of Camille. "Kneel," he said. "Apologize for being jealous of her, or get out." The first laugh came from somewhere behind Marcus. Another followed, shorter and less certain. Most of the room did not laugh. That almost made it worse. People looked down at their drinks. A woman near the aisle stared at Marcus as though she was waiting for him to say he was joking. He did not. My mother reached my side before I had moved. Her fingers closed around my forearm. She was not smiling. She looked frightened, not for me exactly, but for the day collapsing around us. She whispered that I should just get through it and deal with everything tomorrow. Tomorrow. That word had been used to bury more things in my family than any lie Marcus had ever told. I wish I could tell you I refused immediately. I wish the woman I became later had already existed completely inside me that afternoon. She did not. My knees touched the floor. The concrete was harder than I expected through the fabric of my dress. Heat climbed from my chest into my face. Someone shifted a chair. The laughter had stopped. I could smell flowers from the arrangements near the ceremony arch and the sharp citrus of somebody's perfume. Those useless details stayed with me because my mind seemed determined to notice everything except what I was doing. I was 35 years old, kneeling at my brother's feet, while he prepared to tell me what I was supposed to confess. Tears came before I could stop them. Marcus began supplying the shape of the apology. He wanted jealousy, resentment, years of refusing to be happy for him, a habit of ruining moments that belonged to other people. The words were newer than the ones he had used 8 years earlier. The structure was not. He was giving me a version of myself and waiting for me to repeat it. Something inside me went still. I pressed one hand against my knee and stood. Marcus stopped speaking. I did not wipe my face. I did not look at my mother. I looked at Camille. "Before you marry him, ask what he once begged me to keep secret." Her expression emptied first, as though her mind needed a second to catch up with what she had heard. Then she turned toward Marcus. The color left his face. He recovered quickly enough to laugh, but the sound was wrong now, too light, too deliberate. He told the room I was doing what I always did, turning a happy occasion into something about me. Yet the old magic in his delivery had weakened. Camille was no longer watching me. She was watching him. She asked me only one thing: whether I had known Marcus intended to stage a public reconciliation before the vows. I said no. Marcus immediately called it a misunderstanding and tried to move everyone along, but Camille did not move with him. Her shoulders had gone rigid beneath the thin fabric of her dress. She looked toward the coordinator and quietly told her the 4:30 ceremony would not begin yet. The room changed without anyone announcing that it had changed. Staff opened the cocktail area again. Guests drifted away in confused clusters. Conversations restarted in lowered voices. Marcus followed Camille toward a side room, then turned back long enough to look at me with an expression I had not seen in years. Not anger, calculation. He still believed there was a version of what had just happened that he could make everyone accept. I picked up my bag and headed toward the service corridor, desperate for cold air and distance. I had almost reached the exit when I heard Camille behind me. She had come alone. Her face was composed now, but the happiness I had seen half an hour earlier was gone. She did not ask whether Marcus was a bad man. She did not ask whether she should leave him. She asked the only question that mattered. What did he ask you to keep secret? I looked back toward the hall where my brother was already trying to repair the story. The reason he has spent 8 years calling me jealous. Camille did not press me for the rest of the answer in the service corridor. Maybe she could see that if she asked one more question, I would either tell her everything in a place that smelled like industrial cleaner and cut flowers, or I would shut down completely. She stood there for a few seconds, with one hand resting against the wall, the ivory fabric of her dress catching the fluorescent light in a way that made the whole moment feel strangely unfinished. Half an hour earlier, she had been waiting to walk toward Marcus. Now she was standing beside a catering cart, asking his sister why he had spent 8 years calling her jealous. I told her there was more to the story than I could explain in 2 minutes, and that she deserved to hear it without 95 guests waiting outside for a verdict. I also told her I would not tell her what to do about Marcus. That choice belonged to her. Camille studied my face, then nodded once. She returned toward the side rooms without asking me to stay. Mom found me before I reached the exit. Patricia Ward had spent most of her adult life treating conflict like smoke in a kitchen, something that could be managed if everyone stopped waving their arms and opened the right window. Her face was pale now, and the careful makeup around her eyes had begun to settle into the fine lines beneath them. She did not defend Marcus's command to kneel. She did not tell me the laughter had been harmless. Instead, she focused on the one part of the disaster she thought might still be repaired: timing. She said whatever Marcus had done 8 years ago, whatever bitterness still existed between us, the wedding had been the worst possible place to drag it into daylight. Her voice stayed low because even in a service hallway, with the ceremony suspended and guests already whispering, Mom was still trying to keep the volume of the family intact. Couldn't one of you have let today belong to the wedding? The sentence landed harder than if she had simply blamed me. Marcus had pointed at the floor. Marcus had announced my jealousy to a room full of people. Marcus had turned my presence into a performance without asking me. Yet somehow the responsibility for preserving the day had still found its way into my hands. I reminded her of that, not with a speech, but with the simplest fact I had. I had not called myself forward. I had not planned an apology. I had not ordered anyone onto their knees. Mom's mouth tightened. She looked toward the closed door behind which Marcus and Camille had disappeared, then back at me. The movement told me exactly where her mind was. There was a wedding on the other side of that door, or there had been one 30 minutes earlier, and she wanted desperately to believe there was still a sequence of careful sentences that could put it back together. For most of my life, I had been the easier child to ask. Marcus exploded. I withdrew. Marcus pushed. I went quiet. Marcus made a scene. I was asked whether I could please be reasonable. Standing there in my wrinkled dress, with the faint pressure of the concrete floor still lingering in my knees, I finally saw how efficiently that arrangement worked. For everyone except me, I left Mom without giving her the reassurance she wanted. I did not promise to apologize. I did not promise to disappear. I simply went outside. The September air had cooled while we were inside. The river moved darkly beyond the warehouses, and traffic hummed from the streets farther inland. I stood near the side entrance until my breathing settled. I had expected exposure to feel like release. Instead, my body felt as if I had stepped off something high and had not yet discovered where the ground was. Camille found me again about 20 minutes later. This time we sat in a small, neutral room away from the main hall, with the wedding coordinator moving in and out nearby. Camille had removed nothing except the smile she had been wearing when I arrived. She did not look furious. That would have been easier to interpret. She looked like someone rebuilding a timeline in her head. She explained that Marcus had told her our relationship had improved enough for a brief, fresh start gesture before the vows. He had spoken about it casually, as though the awkward part had already been settled between us, and the only remaining question was when to fit it into the welcome. Camille had believed he had discussed the basic idea with me. He had not. I told her that plainly. She did not demand an immediate explanation for why Marcus would arrange something I had never agreed to. She asked once, and when I said the answer began years before she met either version of this story, she let the silence sit between us. What mattered was that she began remembering things. Marcus had repeatedly asked whether I had confirmed my RSVP. He had been unusually specific about making sure I was present before the pre-ceremony welcome. He had suggested I remain somewhere easy to call forward, rather than disappearing into the crowd. He had also cared far more than Camille had understood about several particular friends arriving early. At the time, those details had looked like wedding logistics. After watching him point at the floor, they looked different. Camille did not turn them into evidence. Neither did I. People planned weddings obsessively. Grooms cared about seating, schedules, arrivals, family tensions. None of those facts proved what Marcus had intended. But they changed the shape of the afternoon. The kneeling had not come from nowhere. When Camille left to deal with what remained of her wedding day, I drove home alone. By then, Marcus had already started repairing his version of events. I learned that first from one relative who called while I was still in the car, and another who contacted me after I reached home. I did not need a dozen messages to understand what he was doing. The language was familiar enough. According to Marcus, I had arrived carrying years of resentment. I had waited until the most important day of his life to punish him for being successful. The reconciliation had been his attempt to end an old family feud, and I had responded by threatening him with some vague secret in front of Camille. The command to kneel became a regrettable moment of temper. Everything around it became my motive. Marcus rarely needed to erase an event. He only had to move the center of gravity until everyone remembered why somebody else had supposedly caused it. His explanation already fit the version people had heard for years. I was the sister who could not tolerate his success. To anyone who knew only that story, the wedding could look like confirmation instead of contradiction. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. The apartment was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator cycle on. My shoes were still on because I had not yet decided whether I was home or merely hiding there. When I finally looked at myself in the dark reflection of the window, my mascara had dried in a faint gray line beneath one eye. I was furious with Marcus, but recognition kept intruding. For 8 years I had told myself one sentence. He made me keep it secret. In my head, it had hardened into fact. That night, when I tried to imagine telling Camille everything, an older memory pushed through the cleaner version, a conference room in August 2018, the campaign deck between us, Marcus losing his polish when he understood I was serious, and me sitting across from him while calculating what the truth might cost me too. Marcus had begged, but I had agreed. No one had physically stopped me from continuing. I had been frightened by what formal conflict might do to my career, my reputation inside the firm, and a family that treated open disagreement like failure. Marcus had used those fears because he knew them, but they were still mine. If I was going to tell Camille what he had hidden, I could not begin by hiding the part that made me look weak. Marcus stole my work, but the lie survived because, when I finally had the chance to force the truth into the open, I chose not to. The choice I admitted to myself that night had been made in August 2018, when I was 27, and still believed one difficult decision could be contained if everyone involved behaved afterward. Back then, Marcus and I worked for the same mid-sized advertising and brand strategy firm, although our jobs rarely overlapped completely. I worked in strategy, which meant long hours turning research into positioning, finding the one idea that could hold a campaign together without collapsing under its own cleverness. Marcus worked closer to business development. He was better with clients than I was, especially in rooms full of people who needed to feel confident before they understood the details. I used to joke that I built the bridge, and Marcus convinced everyone it had always been safe to cross. There had been affection inside that competition. That was the part years of resentment had almost erased. We ate lunch together when our schedules allowed it. He knew which vending machine coffee I hated and would bring me a decent one before an early presentation. When I got trapped inside my own perfectionism, Marcus could lean over my desk, read 2 paragraphs, and tell me which sentence actually mattered. I trusted his instincts even when I rolled my eyes at how pleased he was with them. More importantly, I trusted him with unfinished work. That summer, our firm was preparing a major regional campaign. I had spent months on the strategy beneath it. Audience research, the positioning problem, the central concept, and the architecture that would eventually shape the pitch. It was not a brilliant sentence I had written in an afternoon. It was the accumulated result of dull mornings, abandoned directions, client interviews, revised briefs, and pages covered in notes that made sense only after I had stared at them long enough. Marcus had legitimate involvement. He understood the client relationship better than I did, knew which executives were nervous about risk, and often helped me translate a strong idea into language that would survive a sales room. Because we were siblings as well as coworkers, I shared early drafts with him more casually than I would have with almost anyone else. I sent him unfinished slides, let him look over positioning statements, and talked through concepts over coffee without documenting every exchange, as though one day we might need to prove ownership. That trust was exactly why I did not understand what I was seeing at first. I learned that Marcus had presented the campaign in a high-visibility industry setting tied closely to an internal promotion opportunity. The work was being praised. People were talking about his strategic leadership. His name had become attached not merely to bringing in the client, but to the thinking that made the campaign successful. Mine had faded toward the edges. I remember staring at one version of the presentation on my screen and recognizing my own structure beneath his language. The order of the insights. The problem statement I had spent 2 weeks refining. The framework I had built so the creative team would know what every later decision was supposed to serve. Marcus had not copied a single page and forgotten to change my name. It was worse than that. He had taken the shape of my work and presented himself as the person who had shaped it. Recognition had already begun converting into opportunity by the time I confronted him. People inside the firm were talking openly about his promotion. The client was pleased. Senior leadership liked the story of the persuasive relationship builder who had also helped drive the strategy. Marcus had stepped into a version of himself that looked larger than the job he had held a month earlier. I asked him to meet me in one of the smaller conference rooms after most people had left. At first, he treated my anger as an argument about emphasis. He reminded me that he had worked the client. He said we had discussed the concept together, that strategy and business development had overlapped from the beginning, and that no campaign belonged to one person inside an agency. There was enough truth inside those statements to make them dangerous. Yes, he had contributed. Yes, I had shared drafts. Yes, dozens of people eventually touched the campaign. None of that made him the author of work I had built before he entered most of those conversations. I told him I was taking the issue to management. That was when Marcus changed. The easy confidence left his face. He stopped sitting back in his chair and leaned forward instead, both forearms on the table. He began explaining everything that could happen if I forced the dispute into a formal review. The client could hear about it. Leadership could decide both siblings had poor judgment. My own habit of sharing unfinished material with Marcus could muddy the authorship question. His promotion could disappear. Instead of being remembered for the campaign, we might become known as the brother and sister who detonated a family war inside the office. He did not invent those risks. That mattered. A cleaner villain would have been easier to resist. I raised the concern anyway. Management began preparing to review how the project had been credited and how Marcus had represented his role. Nothing had been decided yet. There was no secret ruling waiting to rescue me. Only the possibility that people above us would start asking uncomfortable questions. Marcus found me before that happened. The conference room felt colder that day. I remember the campaign deck lying closed between us, because neither of us needed to look at it anymore. He asked me to stop, not casually, not with the polished language he used around clients. He begged. He said he would fix the attribution after the promotion pressure passed. He would make sure my role was recognized properly. He said forcing a review now could damage the client relationship and stain both our careers. Then, because he knew exactly which pressure point had worked on me since childhood, he brought Mom into it. Patricia had already learned enough to know we were fighting, and she had been asking both of us not to destroy our relationship over one project. That phrase stayed with me. One project. As if the size of the object determined the size of the betrayal. Marcus wanted a compromise. We would describe the work as overlapping collaboration. I would withdraw my complaint before management reached a formal finding. He would correct the public imbalance quietly later, once the promotion decision and client attention had settled. I knew what the honest answer should have been. I also knew what continuing would cost. For days, I had imagined myself defending every draft I had shared with my own brother, explaining every informal conversation, proving that trust did not equal permission. I pictured walking into meetings where people who had once discussed strategy with me would instead wonder whether I was fighting because Marcus had been promoted and I had not. I imagined Mom trying to divide holidays between us, calling each of us separately, asking how a campaign had become important enough to break a family. And beneath all of that was a fear I hated admitting. What if the review became messy rather than decisive? What if I was right and still emerged looking difficult? Marcus had created the problem, but he had not created that fear. I agreed. The internal language we settled on was vague enough to make everyone uncomfortable and specific enough to let the matter close. The work would be treated as collaborative. I withdrew the complaint before the firm made any formal determination about what Marcus had done. Marcus hugged me afterward. His hands pressed hard against my shoulders, and for a moment he sounded like my brother again, rather than the man I had nearly forced into a professional review. He promised I would never regret helping him. I wanted desperately to believe him. For several weeks, things almost returned to normal. We stopped discussing the campaign. Work moved forward. Marcus stepped into the promotion people had already expected him to receive. I told myself his promise about fixing the credit simply needed time. Then, a few months later, I heard the first altered version from a relative. It came casually, with no sense that a grenade had just been rolled across the room. Marcus said you accused him because you were upset he got promoted. I remember going completely still. That was not the compromise I had accepted. But standing there, I understood what my withdrawal looked like from the outside once Marcus supplied the explanation. I had thought I was helping bury a dispute. Marcus had already begun turning my silence into a confession. The first altered version of what happened did not sound dangerous enough to fight. That was part of why it survived. When I heard that Marcus had told a relative I accused him because I was upset about his promotion, I corrected the sentence once. I said the dispute had been about the campaign, not the promotion. The relative gave me the kind of tired smile people use when they believe two siblings are arguing over language rather than truth. By then, Marcus and I were both adults with jobs, and no one in the family wanted to understand project credit, internal reviews, or why the difference between collaboration and appropriation mattered. The easiest explanation was that we had competed at work, feelings had been hurt, and eventually I had backed down. For a while, Marcus called it a misunderstanding. That word was useful because it did not accuse me of anything directly. A misunderstanding suggested equal confusion, two perspectives, nobody entirely wrong. It allowed family dinners to continue without anyone choosing a side. It also allowed Marcus to keep the promotion and the reputation attached to the campaign without ever making the correction he had promised. I waited for him to do it anyway. Months passed, then a year. The campaign stopped being the thing everyone at work was talking about, but it did not disappear. Marcus carried it forward whenever he talked about the work that had established him. Each time I heard him describe that period, his role seemed to expand by a few inches, while mine became harder to find. The family story changed with it. At one gathering, a couple of years later, Marcus made a joke about how badly I had taken his promotion. It was delivered lightly enough that challenging him would have made me look humorless. Mom smiled without really laughing. I remember holding a serving spoon over a bowl and thinking about how ridiculous it would sound to stop dinner and explain that the promotion had never been the point. So I put the spoon down and said nothing. That moment mattered more than I understood then. Marcus did not need me to agree with him. He only needed me not to interrupt. By the next time I heard the story, the language had shifted again. I had not merely been upset when Marcus got promoted. I had been competitive, then resentful, and eventually jealous, as if the family had agreed on the diagnosis without ever asking me. ordinary behavior began supporting it automatically. If I skipped an event for work, I was avoiding Marcus. If I disagreed with him, old rivalry was showing. Silence looked like sulking. I could have challenged it more aggressively. Instead, I kept imagining the questions my own compromise had created. If the theft was so serious, why had I accepted collaboration language? Why had I waited years? Correcting Marcus now meant admitting that my silence had not been forced every day. It had become a choice I was still making. Eventually, I left the firm. The decision was not dramatic. I accepted another job, packed my desk, and told myself I was moving toward better opportunities rather than away from Marcus. Some of that was true. Later, I became an independent brand strategist and communications consultant. My name appeared on my own proposals. Clients hired me for my work, and the distance felt clean. For years, I treated that distance as victory. Marcus and I became polite rather than close, and I stopped expecting him to correct anything. Reopening the old dispute felt like voluntarily stepping back into a room I had escaped. The less flattering truth was that I had built a new life partly, so I would never have to test whether I could survive telling the old one completely. Then Marcus met Camille. It was 2023 when Camille began appearing regularly at family events. I liked her almost immediately. She watched before she spoke, remembered what people told her, and could redirect an uncomfortable conversation without pretending it had never happened. Her attention made people feel seen rather than managed. At first, I thought her presence might soften something between Marcus and me. Instead, I began noticing how carefully he had prepared her for me. Nothing he said in front of me was dramatic enough to challenge. He referred to our competitive history with the affectionate patience of an older brother who had long ago forgiven a difficult younger sister. He sometimes made jokes about how seriously I took work. When Camille asked a perfectly ordinary question about why Marcus and I had once worked at the same firm but rarely discussed it, he answered before I did and reduced the entire history to sibling rivalry and professional overlap. He never needed to call me a liar. He simply made sure Camille received a frame before she received me. After that, I noticed small signs of caution. If Marcus mentioned a promotion or a successful client, Camille sometimes glanced toward me as if checking my reaction. I resented her for believing him, which was unfair. Marcus had given her a confident version of the past. I was the one still behaving as though the truth were too complicated to say. Months before the wedding, that discomfort finally became strong enough that I tried. Camille and I had a brief moment without Marcus nearby. I told her his version of what happened between us at the old firm was incomplete. I did not accuse him in detail. Even then, I softened the edges. I said the professional dispute had been more serious than simple jealousy, and that Marcus had benefited from work I believed was mine. Camille listened. Then she told me Marcus had already mentioned that. According to the version she knew, I had once accused him of taking my work and later withdrawn the complaint. She did not say it cruelly. That almost made it worse. The fact that I had withdrawn was sitting there between us like an answer. I could have continued. I could have told her about the conference room, the review management had been preparing, the promise Marcus made, the vague collaboration statement, and the way he began changing the story almost immediately afterward. Instead, I heard how defensive I already sounded. So I retreated. I said the situation had been complicated and let the conversation end. Months later, kneeling on that warehouse floor, I paid for that decision too. In the days after the wedding, the pattern was impossible to miss. The first altered version, the family joke I let pass, the distance I called closure, Camille quoting my own withdrawal back to me. I had spent years waiting for a perfect moment to tell the truth when nobody would think I was bitter and Marcus could no longer twist it. No such moment existed. A lie does not become harmless because you stop arguing with it. Sometimes silence just gives it time to learn your name. By then, Marcus's version had learned mine so well that he could say jealous in a room full of people, and they already knew who he meant. A few days after the wedding, my phone lit up with Camille's name. Her message was brief. She wanted to meet again. She had spoken with Marcus, and something he told her about the apology no longer fit with what she had seen herself. I read the final sentence twice. Marcus told me something else about the apology. I need to know whether it's true. Camille chose a cafe far enough from the riverfront that nothing about it reminded me of the wedding. No exposed brick, no white flowers, no music spilling through open doors. Just a narrow room near a row of offices, the smell of roasted coffee, and gray September light flattening itself against the windows. When I arrived, she was already seated at a table near the back. She looked different without the wedding surrounding her. Not devastated in the dramatic way people expect a bride to look after a ceremony stops before it begins. Mostly tired. Her hair was pulled back. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and her engagement ring was still on her hand. I noticed it because I was trying not to notice it. I sat across from her and waited. 3 days earlier, Camille had said Marcus told her something else about the apology. I had spent those days imagining possibilities, most of them shaped by information I already knew. Maybe Marcus had claimed Mom suggested the reconciliation. Maybe he had said I secretly wanted forgiveness. Maybe he had told Camille I had been planning to make peace for months. The truth was more deliberate than any of those. Camille explained that weeks before the wedding, Marcus had told her I had contacted him privately. According to him, I had admitted that my resentment toward his success had gone on too long. I supposedly wanted to make things right before he married her. More than that, Marcus said I had personally requested that the apology happen in front of family and friends because I wanted the reconciliation to feel final. For a few seconds, the sounds around us seemed to separate from the room. A spoon struck ceramic somewhere near the counter. An espresso machine released steam. Someone dragged a chair across the floor. I could hear all of it while Camille's words settled. I had never contacted Marcus. I had never requested an apology. I had never told him I regretted being jealous, because I had never admitted jealousy in the first place. Camille had not told me that detail immediately, because she first wanted to ask Marcus whether she had misunderstood him. She had spent the days after the wedding separating confusion from intention, and when she gave him the chance to clarify, he did not withdraw the claim. He had not merely implied that I knew. He had said the idea was mine. I sat back and looked through the window rather than at Camille. 3 days earlier, I had thought the worst part of the wedding was being forced onto my knees. Now that image shifted. The kneeling had been Marcus losing control. The apology itself had been something else. A plan. Marcus had expected public pressure to do what it had so often done in our family. Make me cooperate rather than create a scene. He did not need me eager. He needed me too conditioned to refuse in front of everyone. The planned apology would reassure Camille that the old conflict was settled and leave a room full of witnesses, remembering that I had admitted jealousy. My own voice would become his best evidence. The order to kneel had not been the clever part of the plan. That was Marcus's overreach when I refused the script. The plan itself was simpler. Put me in public, make silence expensive, and trust that I would choose peace again. The thought made the backs of my arms cold. Camille watched me quietly. She did not seem interested in hearing me insult Marcus. She wanted to understand the contradiction she was sitting inside. Eventually, she asked the question. I had known she would ask if I ever told the truth properly. If Marcus had really taken my work in 2018, why had I withdrawn the complaint? There was no way around that question without becoming Marcus in a different direction, changing emphasis, until my own choices disappeared. So I gave her the answer that made me least comfortable. I told her about the campaign, but only enough for the facts to make sense. I had built the strategy. Marcus had legitimate access because he handled parts of the client relationship. He presented himself as the driving strategist in a way that benefited his promotion. I challenged it. Management was preparing to review what had happened. Then Marcus begged me to stop. I told Camille about his promise to correct the credit later, about Mom pleading with us not to destroy the family over one project, and about my fear that the review would turn an act of betrayal into a public sibling spectacle inside the company. But this time, I did not finish the story by saying I protected him. I told her I protected myself, too. At 27, I had been frightened of being known as the woman fighting her brother at work. I knew I had shared drafts with Marcus informally, and I worried that a messy investigation would make ownership difficult for outsiders to understand. I feared being right about what he had done, and still emerging professionally damaged by the fight over it. Marcus exploited those fears, but he did not invent them. I withdrew it because I was scared of what telling the whole truth might cost me. That was the only sentence I needed to say directly. Camille lowered her eyes to the table. She did not rush to reassure me that I had done nothing wrong. I was grateful for that. Sympathy would have been easier, but it would also have allowed me to slide back into the cleaner version of myself I had lived with for 8 years. She asked whether management had ever concluded that I fabricated the accusation. No, there had been no such finding because I withdrew before the internal review reached one. That absence had later become useful to Marcus. He had taken, there was no formal determination, and slowly converted it into, Elena could not prove it. Then into, Elena knew she was wrong. Camille absorbed that without turning it into a verdict. For the first time since the wedding, I stopped watching her face for signs of which relieved more. That was not my decision to win. When she eventually asked whether I thought she should still marry Marcus, the question tightened something in my chest. A week earlier, I might have answered too quickly. Part of me still wanted the clean satisfaction of seeing the engagement end, because the truth had finally outweighed Marcus's version. But telling Camille what to do would have turned her into another object, inside a fight between my brother and me. Marcus had spent years assigning motives to other people. I was not going to reclaim my voice by taking hers. I told her I could describe what happened to me. I could own the part I had played in letting it remain unresolved. If she wanted to verify the basic facts, there was one person from the old firm who had been close enough to the dispute to confirm what he personally remembered. Neil Harper had overseen the cross-functional client team in 2018. He knew I had raised the project credit concern. He knew management had been preparing to review it. He had also been present for enough of the internal process to know that my withdrawal was not the same thing as a finding against me. I made the limits clear, too. Neil had not been in the private conference room when Marcus begged me. He could not prove what my brother promised. He could not tell Camille what kind of husband Marcus would be. Camille asked for his name, and enough context to approach him without pretending she knew more than she did. I gave her that. Nothing else. There was no hidden dossier or recording. What remained from 2018 was ordinary professional memory and project history enough to test Marcus's version without pretending anyone could prove our private conversation. Camille wrote Neil's name down on her phone, then placed it face down beside her coffee. For the first time during the meeting, Camille looked less confused than sad. Whatever she eventually decided about an 8-year-old betrayal, she had been standing close enough at the wedding to see Marcus point at the floor when I refused a reconciliation I had never promised. When we stood to leave, I still had no idea whether she intended to end the engagement, postpone it, forgive Marcus, or confront him again. She did not owe me that answer. At the door, she stopped with one hand against the strap of her bag. If he lied to me about you asking for that apology, then the problem isn't 8 years old. After Camille left the cafe, I did something that would have been impossible for me 8 years earlier. I went back to work. Not because I stopped caring what she would decide. I cared too much. Every time my phone lit up beside my laptop, my eyes moved toward it before I could stop them. But I did not call her. I did not send a second explanation, or another memory I thought might help, or some carefully worded message reminding her what Marcus had done. I had given her the truth I could stand behind, and one name she could use to check the part that did not depend on either sibling's version. What happened next belonged to her. The lack of control felt almost physical. For years, even my silence had been a form of management. Avoid the fight, avoid becoming the cause, avoid forcing anyone to choose. Now I had spoken, and I could not control where the truth went. Marcus apparently found that even harder than I did. He called me 2 days after my meeting with Camille. I almost let it go unanswered. Then I saw his name pulse across the screen and knew that avoiding him would feel too much like the old habit. I picked up and said nothing beyond what was necessary. Marcus did not waste time pretending he wanted to repair our relationship. He had already built a smaller version of the wedding disaster and wanted me to help him install it. He was willing to admit he had gone too far. That was the phrase he kept returning to. The kneeling had been excessive. The public pressure had been a mistake. He had been emotional. He would own that much if I would tell Camille the rest of the conflict was what he had always said it was, an old sibling grievance fueled by my resentment over his success. The offer was the old bargain in a different suit, admit the part everyone could already see, so I would protect the lie underneath it. 8 years earlier, it had been collaboration instead of theft. Now it was momentary cruelty instead of deliberate manipulation. Recognizing the pattern steadied me more than anger would have. I'm not signing on to another partial story. Marcus went quiet, not defeated, recalculating. He warned me that if Camille ended the engagement, people would know exactly who caused it. I could hear how certain he still was that shame would do the work persuasion could not. 8 years earlier, that threat would have reached every weak place inside me. This time, I looked at the notes spread across my desk, the proposal I had been working on before he called, my own name printed at the top of the strategy section. What other people decided to believe was no longer something I could manage for him. I told him that, and ended the call before he could reshape the conversation again. The silence afterward was not surrender. It was a boundary. Camille did not contact me immediately after that. I knew she had Neil's name, but I did not know whether she would actually reach out to him. Part of me hoped she would. Another part hated the idea of an old professional wound being opened for inspection yet again. When she finally called, her voice sounded calmer than it had at the cafe. She had spoken with Neil once. The conversation was brief enough that there was almost nothing procedural to recount. With my permission, Neil confirmed only what he personally remembered. I had raised a real project credit concern. Management was preparing an internal review. I withdrew before any formal finding. He had never seen a conclusion that I fabricated the allegation. He remembered Marcus pushing for a quiet resolution, and the project structure he knew at the time treated me as the lead strategist. He could not prove what Marcus promised me privately. That was enough to expose 3 mismatches. Marcus had told Camille my accusation collapsed because I could not prove it. Neil remembered a review that ended only because I withdrew. Marcus had described himself as the central strategic mind. Neil remembered me as lead strategist. And Marcus had said I personally wanted the wedding apology, while Camille had watched me learn about it in front of everyone. Camille did not give me a verdict. She only said the verification made it harder to treat the wedding as an isolated mistake. Marcus kept defending an old dispute, while the question she was now sitting with concerned the man who had pointed at the floor 6 days earlier. She still did not tell me what she planned to do. Instead, she asked for space from Marcus, from me, and from every family member who thought they could help by explaining what she should believe. I told her I would respect that. Later the same day, Mom called. Marcus had already reached her. According to him, Camille was overwhelmed because I had poisoned the relationship with an old story that should have stayed buried. Mom did not accuse me of lying. Her request was softer than that, which made it harder to dismiss. She wanted me to stop talking to Camille for a while, so the two of them could repair whatever remained of the engagement without outside pressure. A week earlier, that request would have enraged me. Now I simply told Mom I would not contact Camille. She sounded relieved. I did not explain that I was not doing it for Marcus. I was doing it because Camille had asked me herself. For the next several days, nothing happened. At least nothing I could see. Camille did not call. She did not send updates. I did not know where she was sleeping, how often she and Marcus were speaking, or whether the ring was still on her hand. I stopped trying to imagine scenes I had no right to narrate. Meanwhile, Marcus began telling people the wedding would be rescheduled privately. I heard it twice through family, always delivered with the confidence of something already decided. He was telling people Camille just needed time away from the spectacle and that a smaller ceremony would happen once everyone calmed down. That sounded exactly like Marcus. If reality paused, he filled the silence with a version of the future that made him look as though he still controlled it. I wanted to believe he was bluffing. I was not sure. At night, I found myself staring at my phone on the kitchen counter, remembering the way Camille had said the problem was not 8 years old. Then another day passed without a word. For the first time since I stood up at the wedding, Marcus's version seemed to be moving again, while mine remained perfectly still. And I had no idea whether that meant he was winning. Marcus's version did not need everyone to believe it completely. It only needed enough people to prefer it. That was what I began to understand during the first days of October, while Camille remained silent and Marcus kept telling people a smaller wedding would eventually happen. The reactions that reached me were rarely cruel enough to dismiss. Most came wrapped in concern, discomfort, or the language of fairness. A few relatives thought Marcus had behaved horribly when he ordered me to kneel. They said so before adding that I still should not have brought an 8-year-old secret into his wedding. 2 guests, who had been close enough to hear everything, described the afternoon as a disaster caused by both sides losing control. Someone else acknowledged that Marcus had humiliated me, then wondered why I could not have waited until the next day to tell Camille what I knew. The argument was always about timing. People did not have to defend Marcus to make me responsible for the consequences. They only had to prefer that I had chosen a more convenient moment to stop cooperating. I stopped answering most of the calls, not dramatically. I simply realized I did not have the energy to keep explaining the same sequence. I had not planned the confrontation. I had not known Marcus intended to call me forward. I had not arrived carrying evidence or preparing to destroy a wedding. I had been placed in front of a room and told to confess something that was not true. Anyone who still preferred to debate whether I had selected the perfect moment could do that without me. Mom came to my apartment a few days later. She brought no food, which told me how serious the visit was. Patricia usually arrived with something in her hands whenever she expected an emotional conversation, as if a casserole or bag of groceries could make difficult words less sharp. This time she came with only her purse and sat at the edge of my sofa without taking off her coat. She looked exhausted. Marcus had been speaking to her constantly. Camille had not given him a final answer, but he continued, insisting that the engagement could be repaired if everyone stopped feeding the conflict. Mom wanted to believe him. I could see it in the way she kept referring to the wedding as postponed rather than stopped. She did not ask me to contact Camille. She knew I had already agreed to give her space. What Mom wanted was narrower. Marcus had told Mom that Camille had contacted Neil and that he was worried I would go next to the old firm. I had not told anyone I planned to do that, because until that moment, I had not decided that I would. Mom asked me not to. Her reasons were painfully familiar. The campaign was 8 years old. I had built a career elsewhere, and Marcus and Camille were already hanging by a thread. Whatever correction I wanted, she believed it could wait until the family crisis settled. She never said Marcus should be protected from consequences. She simply asked for the old family bargain again. Not now, not publicly, not if the cost was too high. To me, it sounded like the conference room in 2018 with softer furniture. I did not argue. After she left, I remained on the sofa while the light outside faded against the windows. Her request had touched the part of the situation I had been avoiding. Until then, my choices had been reactive. Marcus staged the wedding scene, and I refused it. Camille asked what happened, and I answered. Reopening the professional record would be something I initiated after the immediate threat had passed, so I needed to know whether it was accountability or revenge. The test was simple. If Camille returned to Marcus and he lost nothing else, would I still want the campaign credited accurately? Yes, the work was mine before it became evidence in our family fight. I could not undo the 27-year-old woman who accepted a compromise because truth felt too expensive, but I could stop treating that compromise as a permanent instruction. In early October, I contacted the old firm. I did not demand that they reopen a misconduct case against Marcus. I did not ask anyone to decide 8 years later what had been said behind a closed conference room door. I asked for something much narrower, a historical attribution clarification on the campaign the firm still used in its archived case study material. I stated immediately that I had voluntarily accepted the collaboration language in 2018 and withdrawn my complaint before any formal finding. I was not asking them to erase that. I asked them to look at the ordinary project records they still retained because the campaign remained part of their portfolio, the assignment structure, project brief, and internal case study information, and determine whether the current attribution accurately reflected my role as lead strategist. Sending the request made my hands shake more than standing up at the wedding had. At the wedding, anger had carried me. This required sitting quietly at my desk and attaching my name to the very compromise I had spent years describing as something Marcus forced upon me. People at the old firm could reasonably wonder why I had waited 8 years. I had no elegant answer. I waited because for most of those 8 years, accuracy felt more embarrassing than silence. The firm acknowledged my request and told me it would take time. The project was old. People involved had moved into different roles. Records would need to be reviewed, and anyone whose credited contribution might be affected would be given a chance to respond. That meant Marcus. When I read that, my stomach tightened. For a few hours, I almost wished I had not done it. Then, Marcus called. The sound of his name vibrating across my desk no longer startled me. I watched the screen for a moment before answering. He was furious in a way I had not heard since 2018. The old firm had contacted him because his attribution could potentially change. He accused me of dragging his career into a personal fight and said I was proving every jealous thing he had ever told people about me. There was a time when that accusation would have driven me into explanation. This time, I heard it as a familiar door he expected me to walk through, and I did not. I told him the firm could review its own records and make whatever limited correction those records supported. I was not asking them to punish him, and I was not withdrawing the request. Marcus tried to turn Camille into leverage. He said that if there had been any chance of saving the engagement, I had just destroyed it. That statement almost reached me. Then I remembered the test I had already given myself. I would have made the request even if Camille had gone back to him. That was how I knew the decision belonged to me. Marcus ended the call before I did. After the call, I sat listening to the empty line. The firm had not ruled in my favor. Camille was still silent, and some relatives still thought I had ruined the wedding. Nothing external had been fixed. But for the first time in 8 years, I had taken an action without first calculating whether Marcus could survive it comfortably. My phone vibrated again. I expected his name. Instead, Camille's appeared on the screen. The message contained no explanation, no decision, and no mention of Marcus. She asked if I could meet her the next morning. Camille chose the same cafe where we had met before, but the woman waiting for me the next morning looked less uncertain than she had a week earlier. She was not calmer because anything had become easier. The difference was in the way she sat. The last time, she had kept both hands around her coffee, as though she needed something solid between us. This time, one hand rested on the table, empty. Her engagement ring was still there, but I stopped myself from reading meaning into that. I had spent too many years watching Marcus assign conclusions to details before anyone had actually spoken. Camille had used the space she asked for. She had spoken with Marcus more than once, and, instead of confronting him with everything at once, had allowed him to explain the wedding on different days, after different questions, when he could not rely on one emotional conversation to carry him through. She did not repeat those conversations word for word. She gave me only what mattered. Marcus had offered 3 explanations for why I was supposed to apologize before the vows. At first, he maintained that I had requested it. When Camille pressed him about the fact that I had looked completely blindsided, the story changed. He said Mom had suggested some kind of reconciliation because she was tired of the tension between us. Later, After Camille asked why he had needed an audience at all, Marcus described the moment as something he personally thought would be good for everyone, a chance to clear the air before the marriage began. 3 explanations for one decision could not all be the reason. Camille had given Marcus enough time to explain himself more than once, and each version moved responsibility toward whatever person was not currently challenging him. I knew the pattern. 8 years earlier, it had unfolded slowly enough to become family history. After the wedding, Camille had watched it happen in days. Camille had asked him another question, one narrower than all the others. If I had invented the old accusation because I was jealous, why had Marcus pushed so hard for me to withdraw before the firm reached a formal finding? The first time, Marcus told her there had never been a real review coming. Later, he said the review had been unnecessary because everyone inside the firm already knew I was wrong. Neil's recollection contradicted both. Management had been preparing to examine the issue. Marcus pushed for a quiet resolution, and I withdrew before any finding. Neil could not prove what Marcus said to me privately. He did not need to. Marcus had created the contradiction himself. Camille looked through the cafe window while she explained that part. Morning traffic passed beyond the glass, tires hissing over pavement, still damp from overnight rain. Her voice remained controlled, but I noticed her thumb rubbing once along the edge of her ring before her hand became still again. Camille had spent days asking whether she was punishing the man she loved for something he had done at 30. By then, that was no longer the question. An old betrayal might have been survivable if Marcus had owned it and changed. The wedding showed her he was still willing to invent another person's consent and punish resistance when the life he wanted was threatened. Camille did not raise her voice when she told me what she had decided. That made the words feel heavier. She was ending the engagement. She was not ending it because I had won an argument about an old campaign or because Neil had produced some devastating proof. She was ending it because Marcus still believed he could decide what other people meant, wanted, and agreed to whenever their version threatened the future he wanted. The clearest evidence was not from 2018. Camille had been standing a few feet away when Marcus pointed at the floor, watched his face when I said I had never agreed to apologize, and saw him answer my refusal by trying to force the performance anyway. She had lived that part herself. Relief moved through me so quickly that guilt followed almost immediately. I had wanted the truth to matter. Now it had, and Camille was losing the life she had expected to begin that Saturday afternoon. The wedding dress, the venue, the guests, the months of planning all of it had ended before she reached the vows, because I had said one sentence in front of 95 people. I told her I was sorry the truth had arrived there. Camille looked at me for a long moment. Then she corrected the part I was still trying to carry. "You didn't schedule that apology. Marcus did. The sentence did not absolve me. I had chosen to speak and knew the ceremony might not survive what I said. Those choices were mine. The trap was not. For years, I had confused owning my actions with accepting ownership of every consequence that followed when I stopped protecting Marcus. I was finally learning the boundary between the two. Camille told me she intended to speak with Marcus directly later that day. She did not want me there. I understood. This was not the conclusion of my argument with Marcus. It was the conclusion of Camille's engagement. She was making that decision as the woman who had planned to marry him, not as my ally or instrument. I promised I would stay out of it. When we left the cafe, Camille walked in the opposite direction from me. I watched her only long enough to see her disappear into the morning crowd, then turned toward my car. There was no triumph. Mostly, I felt tired. Part of me had imagined for years that if Marcus's story ever finally collapsed, the moment would feel enormous. I thought truth would arrive like a verdict and divide everything cleanly into before and after. Instead, I drove home through ordinary traffic. People crossed intersections carrying coffee. Delivery trucks blocked one lane. My phone sat silent in the passenger seat. The world did not know my brother was losing the future he had been trying to protect. By afternoon, Mom asked me to come to her house. She wanted to talk about everything that had happened since the wedding, And for once, she did not frame the conversation around repairing Marcus and Camille. I agreed to go. When I pulled into her driveway later that day, Marcus's car was already there. The sight of it stopped me with one hand still on the steering wheel. He had arrived before me. Inside, Marcus had already told Mom that Camille was leaving because I had turned the family against him. I waited for the familiar next step for Mom to come to the door, carrying his version toward me, as though it were a problem I needed to solve. But when she opened the door, she did not tell me Marcus was right. For the first time in years, my mother had heard his story and had not immediately handed it back to me as the truth. Marcus was in Mom's living room when I walked inside, still wearing the same dark jacket I had seen him in at family dinners for years, as though ordinary clothes could make the situation ordinary too. He stood near the window instead of sitting. Mom had taken the armchair across from him, but there was a stiffness in her posture I had never seen when Marcus was angry. Usually, Patricia responded to his anger by making herself useful, offering coffee, changing the subject, finding some small task that gave everyone an excuse to lower their voices. This time, there was nothing on the coffee table except her glasses and a folded tissue she had been turning over between her fingers. Marcus looked at me and started almost immediately. He said, I had finally accomplished what I wanted. The wedding was gone. Camille was leaving. I had dragged an old professional grievance into the most important day of his life because I could not tolerate seeing him happy. Before the wedding, I would have answered every sentence. I would have reminded him who pointed at the floor. I would have explained that Camille had asked questions on her own. I would have defended the timing, the campaign, Neil, the difference between a correction and revenge. That afternoon, I heard how much work all those explanations would have done for him. Marcus needed a debate, because a debate would let him change the subject whenever the current one became dangerous. So I gave him one question. Why did you tell Camille I asked to apologize? The room went very still. Marcus did not answer the question the way a person answers when there is one true explanation. He started with context. The wedding had been stressful. He and Camille had discussed reconciliation. Mom had wanted peace for years. He believed I wanted things repaired even if I had never said those exact words. By the time the explanation reached its end, responsibility had been spread thin enough to cover all three of us. I did not follow him there. I asked the same question again, more quietly. He shifted. Now the public apology had been his idea, but only because he believed I would understand what he meant when he called me forward. He said our family had always handled things informally, and that I was pretending not to understand because it made him look worse. Mom stopped turning the tissue over. Marcus noticed. He tried another direction. He said the entire dispute had become confused because Camille was upset, because I had filled her head with an old story, because everyone was reconstructing a few chaotic minutes, as though he had spent months plotting them. That was when Mom finally spoke. She did not accuse him of plotting. She asked why, if the reconciliation had been his idea, he had told Camille it was mine. Marcus looked at her with genuine surprise. I think that moment hurt him more than anything I had said. For years, Mom had been the safest place for his explanations to land. She usually smoothed contradictions into something both children had supposedly misunderstood. This time, she did not build that bridge. Marcus became sharper. He said we were all obsessing over wording while ignoring what I had done to his life. He returned to the wedding, to my secret, to my jealousy, to the professional complaint I had withdrawn 8 years earlier. The old story again. Except now Mom had heard it change in real time. I watched something in her expression collapse. Not dramatically, but slowly. Her shoulders lowered. She looked at the floor for a few seconds before looking at me. She said she had not known what Marcus had told Camille. She had not known the full truth about the campaign either. I believed that part. Mom's failure had never required secret knowledge. What she did know was simpler. Whenever Marcus became difficult, she asked me to become easier. When he pushed, she asked me not to push back. When he raised the emotional cost of disagreement, she tried to reduce that cost by asking me to absorb it. She had spent years calling that peace because I was usually the one who could be persuaded to cooperate. Her voice tightened when she admitted it. She had repeatedly chosen the easier child to burden. There was no perfect apology attached to the admission. I did not forgive her on the spot. I appreciated that she finally named the pattern, but naming 8 years of unequal pressure did not erase what it had cost me. I told her I needed time. Marcus reacted as though even that were evidence of how cruel I had become. He said Mom was now apologizing for trying to keep her own children from destroying each other. The sentence would once have pulled me back into defending her from him, and him from her. I let it fall. Eventually, Marcus left. The front door closed harder than necessary, but not hard enough to become a scene. Mom remained in the living room afterward, looking at the place where he had been standing. For once, neither of us rushed to repair what had just happened. Later, Camille told me only what I needed to know about her conversation with Marcus. She had ended the engagement. She returned the ring. She also told him she would not reconsider while he continued treating everyone else as the cause of what he had done. I did not ask for the private details. They belonged to her, not to the story I was telling myself about my brother. There was no dramatic public ending. No crowd watched Camille leave him. No photograph spread through the family. Marcus did not collapse in front of everyone. He simply lost the future he had been trying so hard to control. The professional consequence took longer. Over the next few weeks, as October moved toward November, the old firm reviewed only the narrow request I had made. It used the ordinary records that survived because the campaign remained in its portfolio, considered responses from people originally involved, and did not pretend it could reconstruct every private conversation from 2018. The result was modest. The public-facing case study was corrected to reflect that I had served as lead strategist, and an internal administrative note clarified that my 2018 dispute had been withdrawn before any finding that I fabricated the concern. Marcus kept his career, his agency partnership, and every skill he actually possessed. What he lost was the ability to use that campaign as uncontested proof that the strategic success had been his alone. I learned about the first practical consequence from Marcus himself. He had continued using the campaign as a cornerstone example in professional pitches. A current prospect checked the source material, noticed the updated attribution, and asked him to clarify his role. I did not know what happened inside that company, or why they ultimately chose not to proceed with him. Marcus supplied that information later in an angry complaint, framing the lost opportunity as another thing I had taken from him. I had not contacted the prospect or warned anyone about Marcus. I had asked one old company to describe my work accurately. The fact that accuracy now felt like an attack said more about what Marcus had built on its absence than about what I had done. The social change was even quieter. A few people from the wedding contacted me. Most explanations were awkward, but one person simply apologized. He said laughing had been cruel, and he should not have done it. That mattered more than the excuses, because it did not ask me to make anyone feel innocent afterward. Not everyone changed their mind about Marcus. Some still thought I should have stayed quiet until after the wedding. Others believed the truth probably existed somewhere between us. But something fundamental had shifted. When Marcus called me jealous now, people no longer accepted the word as the explanation before they heard the conflict. The story had lost its automatic power. One evening in early November, I was working at my kitchen table when my phone lit up. Marcus. I almost ignored the message. Then I opened it. He asked whether destroying his wedding, his engagement, and his reputation had really been worth it, just so I could be right. I read the sentence once. Then again, the old reflex rose immediately, the urge to explain everything he had assigned to me that did not belong there. I set the phone face down instead. That night, I did not answer him. By the middle of November, people had mostly stopped talking about the wedding. For weeks, the afternoon at the warehouse had seemed enormous enough to divide time into before and after. Then ordinary life reclaimed space. Work deadlines arrived. Family members stopped calling for updates, and the people from the almost wedding returned to their own problems. Even scandal eventually has to compete with Monday morning. Marcus was still angry. I knew he continued telling a smaller circle that I had destroyed his life because I could not stand seeing him happy. Nothing I had done could prevent him from saying that. For years, I had believed freedom required correcting every version of me he created. Now the difference was easier to see. Marcus could tell his story. He simply could no longer require everyone else to live inside it. The campaign attribution had been corrected. Camille knew what he had told her, and Mom had heard his explanations change in real time. Even people who disliked what I had done at the wedding no longer automatically treated jealousy as the answer to every question about me. That was not universal vindication. It was room to exist outside his version. Mom asked to see me alone a few weeks after the confrontation at her house. She came to my apartment in the afternoon, and this time she did bring something, a small container of soup I had not asked for. That was Patricia. Accountability might frighten her, but feeding people remained almost instinctive. She set the container in my refrigerator before we sat down. For once, Mom did not begin by telling me how Marcus was doing, or make his pain the price of admission to a conversation about mine. She returned instead to the moment at the wedding I had tried hardest not to replay, and apologized specifically for telling me to kneel and deal with everything tomorrow. She admitted that tomorrow had been her answer for years. Wait until Marcus calms down. Let the holiday finish, let the family get through dinner, let the promotion settle. She had treated delay as peace because delay usually required more from me than from him. The trouble was that tomorrow kept moving. Mom's hands stayed folded in her lap while she spoke. She did not reach for mine. I appreciated that more than I could explain. Physical comfort would have made it too easy to slide into the familiar roles, with me reassuring her because she felt guilty. She had always thought of me as the child she could reason with. For years, she considered that a compliment. Now she understood what it meant in practice. She repeatedly asked the person least likely to explode to carry the consequences created by the person most likely to explode. I did not tell her everything was forgiven. That would have been another kind of performance. I told her I believed she was sorry. I also told her I was not ready to decide what kind of relationship I wanted with Marcus in the future. Mom nodded. She did not ask me to hurry. That might have been the first truly different thing between us. My last meaningful conversation with Camille was brief. We did not become friends simply because Marcus had hurt us both. Camille had a life to rebuild that had nothing to do with helping me heal, and I had one too. We met once, weeks after she returned the ring, and she told me she had not left because I won. The campaign had given her context, and Neil had confirmed basic facts, but the wedding had made the decision personal. She had watched Marcus define what I supposedly meant, punish me for refusing, and then change his explanations as she learned more. That was what she could not marry. Hearing her say, it stripped away the last trace of a rescue story I had been tempted to tell myself. I had not saved Camille from Marcus. I had simply stopped helping Marcus hide himself. What she did with what became visible belonged to her. The message Marcus sent me in early November remained unanswered on my phone for weeks. Was destroying his wedding, his engagement, and his reputation worth being right? Every time I looked at it, I could see the invitation hidden inside the question, defend yourself inside my version of events. Marcus had always been skilled at deciding the premise before anyone else spoke. His message assumed I had destroyed everything, and that being right had been my goal. I no longer accepted either premise. One evening, I finally answered. This was never about being right. It was about not helping you make me wrong anymore. I sent it before I could soften the sentence, Marcus replied. I did not continue the exchange. Whatever he wrote no longer required an answer, simply because it existed. A few days later, I was finishing a proposal for a new client at my kitchen table. Nothing about the work was dramatic. I had spent the morning tightening, positioning language, removing 2 slides I had become too attached to, and rebuilding a section that had seemed clever until I realized it was not useful. The client sent back one minor administrative request. They wanted the lead strategy line to include my name before the proposal went into circulation. 8 years earlier, that kind of detail would have seemed too small to notice. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Then I typed my name. Elena Ward, lead strategy. There was no rush of victory, and no thought of Marcus seeing it. I thought instead about how many years I had treated accuracy as aggression whenever accuracy made someone uncomfortable. Naming my own contribution did not diminish anyone else, and admitting that I once chose silence did not require choosing it forever. I could not return to 2018 and make the frightened woman in that conference room braver. I did not need to hate her for the compromise she made. I only needed to stop making the same decision for her. You can forgive a mistake without helping someone turn it into your biography. I reviewed the proposal once more, sent it under my own name, and closed the laptop. For the first time in 8 years, nobody had to become smaller for me to tell the truth about who I was.